Anything like a Diet Coke or
Oh, I'm fine.
coffee? I think this chair was designed by the Marquis de Sade. Yeah. The new line furniture.
One of the things I was looking at in this was that I mean, people, often when they argue for the artistic worth of film music, they try and stress that it can work, in the concert hall as a concert piece. And isn't film music actually, you're really going to look at it, better appreciated for what it does in the film as opposed to trying to arrange it for concert pieces or recordings?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Although in the last, probably 8 years, I think there's been an enormous increase in concert classical orchestras doing Pops concerts. I think probably started with Johnny Williams doing the Boston Pops and introducing film music to a more classically oriented audience. And Eric Kunzel with the Cincinnati Symphony is doing a tremendous amount of work. He's actually releasing albums now that are film scores. But I think in every instance, that's a secondary usage of the music. Its main obvious intention is to work with the visuals of the movie. I mean, I write film cues first. If they go to the concert stage, great. But if not, that's not the purpose of writing film music. It's to be performed on. But I do think there's more of an interest in film music per se. It's one of the few areas I think that large works are being commissioned on a regular basis. Just because of the financial restrictions of a symphony orchestra being able to commission a new ballet or a new opera, and of course they do. But if you look at the output of the Hollywood film composing community, and around the world, there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff. So,
what's your feeling on this practice of isolating scores on a Laserdisc or DVD now?
Well, I suppose it's an extension of having a record of the score. That you can hear the music without the sound effects and without the dialogue on an album. So it's sort of a logical outgrowth of it. It's dangerous. I mean, I think we choose the music that goes on albums because it's more listenable, as opposed to being there to support the drama or to work independently with the sound effects. The score I just finished, there was the actual request that the music fill in the spaces around the sound effects. Well, that's a whole lot different than conceiving of a piece of music that has its own musical structure and it's gone unfettered. I think it's an interesting for students and for particularly people that are really, really interested in film scoring. Well, I think it's all right. It's a little disembodied, I would think. It'd be kind of like listening to only one actor in Hamlet. If you just heard Hamlet's part and none of the rest of it, it doesn't really add up.
One thing that struck me about film scores, though, and composers when they're scoring films, there seems to be a sort of unwritten rule in the concert hall of stylistic restrictions, and whereas in film music, like some of yours, like in Cherry 2000 or A Wind or on Deadly Ground, you have an orchestra, but you also have a lot of electronics, and on Deadly Ground also have a lot of like Inuit music going on there. Is that?
No, I think you're right. I mean, there's probably this misconception that the concert hall has always had a greater amount of freedom throughout history. That's not true when you realize that a lot of the music, certainly Beethoven's time and Mozart, it was all commissioned by the princes of the court or the king himself or the queen, whatever. And it was always, the thing that we get accused of writing program music. It's just music. Well, music's always been that way. I mean, very few great composers have been independently wealthy, and they could write whatever they want. You also have the audiences to please. The orchestra is a business, just like Hollywood's a business, and they have their patron series. And it used to be until very recently that unless you played 19th century music at these things, you wouldn't have an audience, and therefore they wouldn't be able to support an orchestra. So there's always a consideration. I mean, that's what the real artistic director of any large philharmonic, they're constantly aware of the financial, commercial pressures that are upon them. So, back to your question, I think that, I think this is one reason why there is an interest in film music, because depending upon the formal requirements of the movie itself, depending upon the strength of the director and the imagination of the composer and the director together, you can do some outrageously interesting things. And I think there's more of a willingness to experiment in film now than ever before with soundtracks, with all the electronic stuff that's being brought in. Like you mentioned, Deadly Ground, we sampled native musicians playing their instruments and then wove that into an orchestral score, which, as far as I know, I don't know if there's an Inuit concerto that exists for drummers and orchestra. That's sort of what Deadly Ground is. And so the possibility, I suspect it's mainly because of the financial, we have the ability financially because of the studios to do a lot of experimentation, to try out new things and new ideas. They're very costly, frankly. It would be very difficult if I didn't have the support of Sony Pictures to have written Starship Troopers. I mean, I may not have attempted it as just a classical concert work.
To expand more on that, I find it interesting that, with the exception of someone like Toru Takemitsu, with some of his concert work, I find in films there's often a very interesting blending in some scores of traditional orchestral music and ethnic music, like in Maurice Jarre's music for The Man Who Would Be King. We had a huge orchestra and and Indian musicians reading Indian traditional notation. And do you think that?
I think part of the reason that exists more in film scoring than on the classical stage or the concert stage, in the case of because of the experimentation with electronics, because of the use of very, very talented specialty musicians, let's say, or ethnic musicians. I used throat singers as well on Deadly Ground. This is a particular kind of vocal quality that the singers have, and no one can reproduce it. So it's almost a one-shot deal. If it goes beyond classical musical literature. I mean, most symphony orchestras have a set number of musicians on their in their complement, and a set number of instruments. It's just been very, very recently that unless an orchestra was located next to a college or a university, or in a major center of recording like Hollywood or London, it would be impossible to get electronic instruments performed on the classical stage, on the concert stage. So there are those limitations that, let's say I had a wonderful, brilliant tabla player. Well, if it goes to an orchestra that doesn't have a tabla player, that part's missing. So that's why I say it's almost a one-off in a way, that we're working in a recording medium, and sometimes those things are very, very difficult to duplicate without the same musicians. Particularly that's the case in electronic sounds. Sometimes these sounds we come by accident. It's a combination of 16 sounds piled on top of each other that, for instance, in Wind, my engineer Tim Boyle and I were recording one of the cues, and we had a power failure. So I rebooted the computer, because it's all computer driven, and we rebooted the console and came back up. Well, the sounds had totally changed, and I couldn't quite get back to what I thought it was that it ought to have been in the first place, and frankly I liked it better. But it was quite by chance. So I think you have to allow for a certain amount of serendipity. I think the requirements of the concert stage are that everything is so carefully placed, like a Beethoven symphony. Even that has changed somewhat, because no one's sure about some of the things he intended. But at least the instruments were the same. An oboe's an oboe. A synthesizer can be anything. And perhaps in the future we'll send out CD-ROMs with all the sounds that are contained, and that goes into a computer, and it doesn't require a musician. But the state of where it's at right now, it's rather in its infancy in terms of being performed on a large scale, or a wide scale, I should say.
Do you think the film scores because they're in films and so many people go to see films, that they've helped keep audiences, people in general, abreast of what's happening developmentally in 20th century music? I mean, very few people ever are exposed to, Penderecki, but a lot of people saw Alien, which Jerry Goldsmith used a lot of music in that style. Do you think that that's a
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends again on the film. If they go to see Bridges in Madison County, they're probably not going to hear much like that. But yeah, I think it enters in very subtly and certainly exposes them to a different sound.
Why do you think there is still a snobbish attitude towards film music in these so-called classical circles?
Well, I personally have never come into any contact with it recently. I understand it still exists in a lot of universities. I would suspect, if anything, it is an art, it is a craft, let's say, that this would be their argument, that is dependent upon other crafts to support it. And that it, in the sense that it is not a pure art form. I mean, it can be, but by definition, it's commercial medium. It's made for hire, and generally, it's done rather quickly, by Brahms standards. Let's say, I think the first symphony took 15 years to write for him, which was way too long. But, so I think perhaps there's the perception that it's just a hack work, and sometimes it can be. It depends on the director, depends on the film. You can have a horrible movie and try to do something rather meaningful musically, and it might be all incorrect, because maybe the music, not that the music should be horrible, but if it's really doing what it's commissioned to do, which is support the drama, and the drama sucks, then the music really doesn't have much of a chance. Music never sounds as good as it does on a really good movie. A really well acted, directed, and written picture. Music sounds great on those films. You can put the same score on a lousy movie and it's not going to be terribly noticeable. In fact, it probably wouldn't work, more importantly.
Do you have any reflections on some of your scores? Like, for instance, Conan the Barbarian is a score that has a kind of almost a cult following among some. Do you have any reflections on that, or why you think that would be? Or outside of the obvious high quality of the music?
Well, I have this theory that composers oftentimes, not oftentimes, once in a while have the fortune to collide with a picture, that somehow speaks to something beyond their intellect. And I think as musical dramatists, composers understand what the requirements of a film, and a film can either have a depth to it, or it can be very shallow and just need some music slapped on top of it. I mean, that's a very crass kind of statement of what it is we do, but I think most of us realize that there are really, really good films, or even if they're not really good in the public perception, or certainly in box office perception, there's something that goes beyond our normal understanding of what a film is. Conan was like that for me. It was just sort of this explosion of I've always been a fan of Gregorian chant. I've always liked large orchestras and choir and mythology. So Conan had all those requirements in it. It needed all of those things. And fortunately, I had a director who, let me do that. It went beyond sword and sorcery in a real surface kind of thing. And Milius always wanted to make sure that the audience perceived this thing as being real. And I think we had talked years ago about my definition of mythology, which is anything that a group of people hold as true becomes mythological. And so trying to, John does it with melody. He was insistent about having a folk song-like melody, which is the Conan theme, the main theme of the film, and that it felt like it was all in place. The other thing about Conan is I think it was sort of the summation of everything I knew about music up until the time I think I was 32 years old when I wrote Conan. And so it kind of carried me through my early years as a pianist, studying to be a concert pianist, through my work at USC, and everything I had learned in the 4 or 5 feature films I had done up to that time. So it was I had to use everything I knew, and that doesn't happen often. And that was definitely one of those times. Starship Troopers is another instance of that happening, where there was this sort of door that opens into another dimension that I can walk into musically. I suspect because neither of them is rooted in any kind of a traditional dramatic framework. I mean, Conan was the Hyborian Age. Nobody knows what that sounds like. There's no music, written about that. Starship Troopers is 400 years in the future. And even though the score itself is not futuristic sounding, it isn't trying to be, 400, what music will sound like 400 years from now, but it gives me the opportunity to create an environment that doesn't exist. If I were to do a film about, like Lonesome Dove, I mean, there's a certain expectation about what the West sounds like. There's a certain expectation about what Mutiny on the Bounty might sound like, even though I think Vangelis, tried hard to play counter to it. So there are no expectations in science fiction. There are no expectations in mythology, because there are no real precedents for it. I like doing that a lot, working in those worlds, those genres. So, I mean, it's happened a few other times as well, besides these two films, but I'd say these are the two major occurrences for me. There's just something about them that takes me to a different place.
As far as that freedom to experiment in films like that, do you find that that's common or rare? I mean, I hear about temp tracks shackling composers' creativity.
It depends on the director. I think it really depends on the director and the producers. The directors that have imagination and have a vision, more importantly, a vision of what kind of film they're trying to make, they want to push it. They want to go as far as it can be taken. The directors or the studio that just has a vehicle that they know is an imitation of another movie, and they want it to sound just like that movie, so therefore, and look like, and the actors, I mean, you've seen these films where they even cast people that look like the stars of an original hit movie, and that's just an imitation. And it takes a very, very strong director to give anybody who's working for them the freedom and to stand up to producers or a studio if they're adverse to his doing that or her doing that. They need a vision, and once you've got that, things generally tend to fall into place. It could be a wrong vision, but at least it's a consistent vision.
Do you think that there's a kind of irony? There's not a lot, but a particular core group of people that say they're film music fans, but what they seem mainly interested in is collecting all the CDs and less appreciating the music as part of the film or in connection to the film.
I don't know. I mean, this is interesting. I mean, I'm sure you're referring to the Cherry 2000 album and things like that. But is that any different than people who collect art that don't know anything about art and really don't like a painting for its own sake, but that it has value which goes beyond? I don't know. This is an issue that... am I offended by it? No, I'm not. I think it's interesting that a CD would ever be considered to be, for itself, an art form, but so is a tomato soup can. So I don't know. These are not things I think about often.
You think there's a kind of irony in the fact that without this constituency of record buyers, composers scoring films would still maintain highly successful careers, even if recordings were never released?
The records are not superfluous, they're peripheral. And the fact that they exist is, again, it's fairly recent. I mean, there were always generally soundtrack albums, but they were really more marketing tools than anything else. There was sort of de rigueur that you would release an album when a film came out just so you could pass it out to the press when they came to the preview or the premiere. I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad they exist. It gives the music a chance to be heard. And I think most composers try to put together a record which is a genuine... two things, actually. I try to go for a serious approximation of what the movie is. And I usually go in show order because of that. Whatever order the cues occur in the movie, I'll try to put them on the album, because if it's well written, that's the way it ought to progress. And the other thing is that it's fairly listenable stuff. There are some films that I suppose you can't do that with them because it's all very aleatoric or effects-oriented kinds of stuff.
There's a lot of aleatoric music in a concert hall too, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, it all comes back to what what the formal dictates of the film are in the film music world. That's what it should be about. The concert hall is anybody, if you had a nightmare the night before and you want to write about it, then maybe that's what it would sound like.
So, I mean, further on that, I mean, like you were saying earlier, there's an idea is people have the composers writing for the concert hall are traditionally the ones who are really writing from the heart. But I mean, aren't there a lot of instances where film composers can make their own personal statements?
I try to. I mean, I think I'm not real facile. I'm not a very facile writer. I'm not particularly a quick writer. I can be. But the stuff that I like the best, that I know, and I don't know how I know, but there's just a feeling when I'm writing it that there's a reality to it. There's a truth to it, that it isn't an imitation of something I heard. It isn't trying to be as clever as possible and use the most outrageous harmonies I can think of. It goes beyond that. There's just, I don't know how to say it. I know that there's more to it than the craft. And I wait for that all the time. I mean, that's why sometimes I'll spend 16, 20 hours a day to write 5 measures, because unless it feels like it has something to do with me and the movie, the movie first, that's what starts the whole thing, because that's truly the blueprint for the way the cue is going to go. The dialogue, you have to play softly. The explosion, either play loud or not at all. The pace is dictated by the pace of the editing, or if the director wants to play counter to that, then the pace can either be fast or slow. So the blueprint comes from the movie. The rest of it, the choices are infinite. Now, why does one composer or any composer make one choice over another? It's something that you relate to the screen. You relate to a character who reminds you of somebody you knew, or a relationship that you had. Or in case of murdering somebody, I've never murdered anybody, but you have to have a fairly active imagination. But yeah, I look for that in my own work, because then what else is it? It's chaos. I mean, it could be anything. It can be anything. That's the frightening thing that we see with temp tracks. You can put up 10 different film scores on certain scenes, mostly montage scenes, because there's no real strong character that's spoken to in a particular piece of music or whatever. But a lot of it works, so what is it that I think I'm going to do differently or better? And that's just a process that goes through my filter that I come back with and say, yeah, this is it. This is this movie. I'm always looking for that.
Do you listen to soundtrack albums yourself?
No. No, occasionally. We Curtis Rausch is my music editor, and 2 or 3 years ago we got really inspired, and we were going to go on this quest to become completely aware of other people's work and just, try to stay abreast of what's going on in the industry. Well, that all went out the door. I mean, we've both been working back to back since 3 years ago. I rarely get to see films, quite frankly. That sounds stupid, right? This is the business I'm in. But the truth of the matter is that it's an exhausting task, scoring pictures, both physically and mentally. And the last thing, and it's more of a time constraint, to actually get out to any place that isn't a studio or a writing room, for me, is an impossibility. No. It's a horrible admission. But on the other hand, rarely does it have anything to do with what I do. I mean, I think it might be interesting to know. I don't keep abreast of I'd like to be aware of what's out there in the classical or the concert world, but it takes time. When I'm writing as well, I rarely want any kind of influence. It could be dangerous. At 4 a.m, something might come into my head that I had heard on someone else's record. I don't, and I don't want to have to wonder if it was in fact something I heard on another film score and then waste the energy trying to track it down, listen to it again, and go, oh no, it wasn't, or oh my God, I've stolen something. So so much of this comes from the subconscious. A lot of the writing, I take frequent naps when I'm writing, not because I'm necessarily tired, but it's just to free up my unconscious a bit. I'll wake after a 10-minute cat nap with an idea for a scene that I'm working on. Well, I want to make sure that, hopefully that idea emanated from me and not something I heard 3 weeks ago. So I make it a real point. I don't watch television. I don't read the newspaper. Not that there's music in the newspaper, but it's just these influences. I mean, I try to absorb myself totally in the picture and stay in that world, particularly if it's a sci-fi thing, mythology. I don't become those characters, but I certainly think like them. Shut myself off from my normal activities. Yeah.
So it reminds me, I remember the first time I interviewed you said that all the Thulsa Doom material in Conan was...
Yeah, from the dream of them being ripped apart by chicken claws or whatever. Yeah.
Do you ever think about what kind of future film music as an art form may have?
I think it's going to go hand in hand with the future of film itself. To really know what that is. I think as long as you need to, to be expressive, if there are films about humans and you're communicating with other humans, then there's always going to be a certain kind of, certain tonal quality or melodic. Melody, as we know, will probably change. It doesn't need to be a connected 8-measure phrase, but it's interesting how it's kind of survived after 10,000 years. I think that's probably still the basic building unit of music, as a phrase. Maybe our definition of phrases will change. I really don't know. I don't think it's... I mean, if I see anything in the media future, I see a return to large orchestras. A lot less emphasis upon purely synthesized scores. But I think that you need to look at what kinds of films are being made, and I think there are a lot of films being made about people, again, as well as the large action things, which, you can't have an outer space epic without a 100-piece orchestra. It'd be hard to. Maybe you could, but again, that's an expectation, I suspect.
This is kind of a question out of left field.
Sure.
But no one's ever asking me. I always noticed, because my mom was like a huge figure skating buff.
Oh, really?
And figure skaters very often skate to film scores. Do you know why that would be?
Sure. Sure. My daughter was a figure skater. Yeah, I think because in film music, people have told me that people that haven't seen a particular film. In fact, yesterday we were mastering Starship Troopers, and the mastering engineer turned to me and he said, he said, I can see the movie. And he's never seen the movie. But by listening to the music, he could see the movie. And I think film music does that because it is so visually oriented, at least it's playing counter to visuals. I think there's a kind of a drama inherent in film music because that's what it is. And I think there's maybe a tightness in the construction of it because generally scenes are 3 to 6 minutes long, so it's not like we're creating a form that's 20 minutes going on this long curve. So I think and it's accessible, and I think that's one of the tenets of film music is that audiences aren't threatened by the sound of the music unless you want them to be. Unless you're ripping somebody's heart out of their body, then you want the music to terrify them. But for the most part, it doesn't do that. It just really does create the subtext to enhance the visuals. So I think it implies visual stuff. Also, there's usually a fairly could be a strong rhythm to it, which I think skaters would depend upon. Either implied or there, but it's one of the ways you can write really fast is to rely upon rhythm. So.
Your daughter ever skated any of your stuff?
Yeah, she did. She did. In fact, mostly my stuff, which at first I thought it was a horrible limitation of her choices of music, but then as she got older and I really realized what a thrill it was to watch my daughter skate to my music. It meant a lot more to me.
That was the same daughter that co-wrote the Q and Conan?
Yeah, Zoe. Yeah, and she wrote a song for Starship Troopers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, performs it on camera.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So she's actually in the film?
Yeah.
Is she like doing acting now?
No, but she is singing and she's writing. She has a group, and yeah, in fact, she's in a movie for Randall Kleiser as well.
Yeah.
She wrote a song for it, performs it on camera.
Are you scoring that one?
No, I've been involved with Starship for a long time.
Yeah. Is she gonna get into film music, you think, or?
No, I think she's really much more interested in writing songs and performing. It's almost as performance art.
Oh.
Although her songwriting ability is extraordinary, and she's quite a good singer. Which, who knew? You know, she never studied voice, but a very strong melodic sense and a very well-defined dramatic sense. Actually, her lyrics are like small films. I mean, they play like movies, you know, rather than songs. It's interesting stuff.
Do you have any final thoughts or reflections of your own you want to air, or?
About what? Yeah, I got a lot of them. About film music?
Yeah, or films.
Well, I mean, no, I'm just really feel fortunate that I've been able to write film music. I mean, I always wanted to. I've been lucky. You know, the muse has been good to me, and I don't know what to say about it. I just do what I think, you know, fits these pictures. I'm in it for the movies, and I'm in it for the music. Where I'm not that aware of what other people are doing, but I don't think I need to be necessarily. I'm not trying to chase anybody around the block with it. You know, it's just very meaningful to me. It's given me I think it's provided me a very interesting life, very rewarding life. I'm just glad I do it.
Okay, thank you.
That's a tough question. I mean, yeah, there's a million things, you know, but